Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no coping. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Hey everyone, this is a friendly reminder that we are here for entertainment purposes only. We may not even be that entertaining at times, but this is not medical advice. Talk to your doctor, check with your healthcare professionals before making any lifestyle changes or medicine changes. What we're talking about is our clinical experience and what we've seen. And so if you really want our advice, you can consult us. You can actually consult me as a doctor, or you can consult my guest and get all your questions answered. But we can't give free medical advice because we can't pay our bills with that, but we can help to educate you a bit and allow you to think a little bit, and always reach out to your medical professional before making any lifestyle changes. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. I was able to drag on the man here, Ivor Cummins, the Fat Emperor, a guy who's had an impact on me just looking at science, talking about coronary calcium scores, what really matters in cholesterol and all these things. And so he kind of diverged from that area to start looking at you. Some of you may have heard we had this thing called COVID that was going around, and he started diving into the data and looking at stuff and came out and said, hey, here's how I'm seeing it. I'm meeting with the world experts. So Ivor, let's catch up, because at that time a lot of people said you were nuts and you were way out of your league and you had no idea what you were talking about and all that kind of stuff. So I would love to hear your journey and really just let people know who you are and why you stood up when everyone else was kind of sticking their head in the sand.
Well, it's great to be back, Brian. Yeah, heady days back then, and it's faded somewhat now. Yeah, I got a lot of persecution and abuse, and I know you did too on many occasions, simply for discussing the data. Now, the funny thing is, and not to be gloating or arrogant.
Oh, I knew it was coming, Ivor. I knew you were going to be gloating by this point, man.
Well, I'll just give the background first. So really briefly, I had a biochemical engineering degree. I went into corporate in 1990. I quickly became a problem-solving expert, leading teams. That was my natural talent. All branches of science, all types of data, didn't matter. It's just what I was made for. So I had a very successful career. It culminated in the last 15 years, managing large teams, people managing, and technical leadership, master technologist over huge worldwide technical issues. So that was kind of my whole background. That was my life. 10 years ago, I got into health because I had poor blood tests. And after 3 visits to 3 doctors, including a professor, I couldn't get answers I expected as a technical person from technical specialists. It was their blood tests, standard. So I just said, I'm going to have to root cause it. And in a few weeks, I realized it was excessive carbohydrate. I realized we've been lied to for decades about fat and cholesterol. And then I jumped into that field. It was fascinating and became quite popular just for telling the technical truth. But the problem arose in March 2020. Very briefly, my wife came to me in March, early March. Oh, are you still going to the Denver conference? And I said, yeah. Well, what about this COVID thing? And she was going to buy masks. And I said, you don't need to do anything. Because I had seen the Diamond Princess cruise ship data, and I know as a highly technical person, that's a Petri ship, shared, air conditioning, aged population, right? Perfect population. And they were all cooped up for weeks with no real controls, and they all got hyper tested. So we knew what COVID would do. And I explained to her that it will not touch me, you, or any of our 5 children. And I'll tell you another thing. And I did say this, because my mother, who was around 80 at the time, I know her blood tests and she has incredibly low insulin resistance, a stellar panel. I said she won't be affected either. And I was right to this day, of course. The Diamond Princess told us everything on the impact. And so she relaxed. And then I began to explore this crazy phenomenon where COVID was getting hyped. It's a nasty ailment. It's like a very bad or severe flu, roughly, in impact. But I was seeing all this hype. So I began to interview like Dr. Ron Rosedale. I interviewed the risk analyst, Tucker Goodrich, and we began to go through the data. And we just explained on the impacts. I interviewed Professor, Michael Levitt of Stanford, Nobel Prize winner, who was saying the same thing about Diamond Princess. And I did all these interviews and just explained the data, but I began to get this huge pushback from a population that was clearly in some kind of mass hypnosis, or the incredible media onslaught 24/7 and scaremongering and fear kind of just turned the population into some kind of somewhat psychotic mass. And I was fascinated. And we could go through each of the things I was saying over that 6 months and getting vilified for, and each one say, well, who was correct?
Well, I think that's what happened. I think it was a perfect storm of the models came out and said, here's how many millions of people are going to die. And so the models were way off because they never took into account natural immunity or previous exposures, having SARS-CoV-1, all these things that in medical science, we know gives you some form of protection. So the other thing was everything was conflated as it was. They weren't saying it was people in their 85 years old that were and morbidly obese and diabetic and having all these comorbidities, and then they were extrapolating that to a healthy 22-year-old marathon runner. So everyone thought the death rate was 50%, and they thought it was way over. And now these same people are coming back going, yeah, we kind of overcalled it, didn't we?
Yeah, and looking for an amnesty. Now, the problem is I'm all for forgiveness. I'm a good, decent person. But the problem is if you forgive and don't learn the lessons, it's going to happen again. And it ruined the world for a few years, destroyed our freedoms, the damage, millions of people suffering and dying early because of the lockdowns. And it was all nonsense from the start. And it came from China. People don't realize that. China implemented these new lockdowns. The WHO had an envoy in China who pointed at their pandemic curve and said, look, they did that with lockdowns and the world will have to do the same. People don't realize that was Bruce Aylward in February. So he took 40 or 50 years of Western science on pandemic management, which was all correct. And it was enshrined in the 2019 November WHO guidelines on pandemics, 100 pages, and it was all correct.
Yeah, we'll link to that. You just gave a talk on that. We'll link to that too and show that what they were saying in 2019.
Yeah, and I have a great from Abir in Pandata group. She did a summary of the guidelines on a single page and a link to it. And we'll just share that, but we can also put a link to the PDF. But the thing is, all of our science was correct. And then Bruce Aylward in China said they did magic things with rabbit's foot. And then the modeling came out from Ferguson, and Ferguson and Imperial College took over $300 million over 8 or 9 years from the Gates Foundation, and their pharma linked up to their necks. So maybe it's not too much of a surprise the models were absurd, but the whole world went mad. And there were a lot of characters and groups and institutions behind the scenes helping drive it. And the politicians, unfortunately, it was perfect for them. So even because they're clueless technically and scientifically, they assume it's kind of true what the experts are saying. And they love a single issue world. Their whole life gets easy. Just shut things down, start printing money, give it out, and keep talking about one issue and don't get pressed on any others. So it's like everyone jumped on the train. And here was me and you and many others, 60,000 doctors and medical scientists signed the Great Barrington Declaration. We can't forget that. So huge numbers, but they were censored, abused, and all they were doing was trying to say, but look, hold on. This doesn't make sense.
Well, I think you were standing in the way of, it was a fear thing, and you were standing in the way to their only way to freedom, because people said you just do this one thing and you're free and you can live your life and everything will be normal again. Then they said, well, it's not exactly that easy. Now we're gonna have to another way. It's kind of, I was thinking about at the very beginning, it's kind of like when someone has a stroke and they're in the intensive care unit and they've lost brain function and they don't tell the family right up, here's what's coming. Here's the implication of what's going to happen. We have to, pretty soon we're going to have to talk about a feeding tube and a trach tube, and then we're going to talk about bed sores, and we're going to talk, and people knew that up front. And then you go, well, it's been 2 weeks, so we might as well just keep going, and then keep going and keep going. And so part of that was you saw it's not going to be 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Those of us who've been around a little bit said you can't flatten this curve in 2 weeks.
Even by their logic, Brian. I mean, Imperial College even showed this series of humps. And if you back off the lockdown, it'll go up again. And then you do a lockdown. They actually revealed the scam in Ferguson, but no one cared because this boiling frog thing was started 2 weeks to flatten the curve and save granny. It was utter nonsense, even from the existing science. It's an aerosol spread. It's ubiquitous. Dr. Hope Simpson wrote the book on influenza transmission, literally wrote the book, 50 years in research laboratories looking at influenza transmission. And coronavirus is the same. It's aerosol transmission. It's ubiquitous. The people who catch it generally is based on their immunological susceptibility. And lockdowns can't work. But they said 2 weeks for a magic solution, and people thought, well, hey, why not? And I thought at the time, Brian, it's complete idiocy, but sure, listen, 2-week holiday, maybe there's no harm. Everyone kind of shuts down and feels good.
I think we all felt that way, right? You go, okay, 2 weeks, let's do this and we'll get it taken care of. But then when you understand and you start looking at the curves, and and I think the thing I love about you is you're not into the emotional touchy-feely. You go, here's the science. And had the science have shown, yes, this is helping, we got to do this, you would have said, hey, we got to do this, it's working, right? But when you look, and it's a trouble when you know the science and no one really understands the science, and there's fear, and they think you're a bad person, you're killing people, and all these things that were thrown out there. If you question it, you were a denier and saying, no, we see it's real, but what's the best way to manage this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've spent decades in crisis management, and maybe not involving people, but huge amounts of money. You can't have emotion in crisis management. Engineers and staff who get emotional and worked up about a problem, they can't function. So you learn over the decades, the worse it is, the more shocking the implications, the more dead calm and dead cold you must become, or you are not functional. But a lot of lay people don't understand that. You have to go back to the data and cool down and look at all the data and look at the best or highest probability of a path forward that will optimize everything and trade off everything. That's the life of a problem solver and crisis manager. But most people don't understand that, and they think waving their hands and virtue signaling will help. It's a human thing, and it's nonsense. It will always make things worse. And by God, did they make things worse? I mean, the impact from, there's a paper out just a couple of months ago, and it's got title, How Lockdown Caused More Even COVID Deaths. And it's an incredible, huge analysis paper. It's number 100 of the papers showing lockdown cost benefit is atrocious. It's shocking. And it basically did analysis showing 69 times more negative impact from the lockdown than any putative lives saved. 69 times. There are many papers, and they generally are between 20 and 40 times more human damage from lockdowns than even the supposed lives saved. And they do assume lockdown saved lives, which it didn't really. But even assuming that, it caused 30 to 40 times more negative impact on the humanity. This is the worst health intervention in human history by a million miles. People don't understand that. And it's all proven in the science. We have 100 papers now, and all of them say the same thing to varying degrees. Lockdown, vastly more harm than any supposed benefit.
Yeah, and in the beginning, we didn't have that data yet. So we kind of said, let's be safe and let's kind of reassess. And that's kind of, I was sitting back reassessing. I was looking at Israeli data. I was looking at all the data and saying, okay, which way is this going to go? And then when you start getting data back and you go, uh-oh, the data doesn't look like it should look if it was working.
Yeah. And the first official paper came out in April 2020. Woods Hole Institute published a paper looking at 50 or 55 countries, and Pandata organization too. And it was clear as day by the end of April, there was no correlation or linkage, not even a correlation between lockdown severity and outcomes or impact. Never mind causation. It wasn't even a correlation at all. So it was out early. Now, myself on, I think, April the 8th of 2020, I interviewed Tucker Goodrich, and he was ahead of the curve. He's big on seed oils and metabolism, smart guy. And I interviewed him, and I had not gone through the data yet in detail, but he had. because he managed the SARS original epidemic for a Wall Street investment firm. So he was very familiar. So he went through a load of fairly comprehensive Excel charts with the Italian data downloaded. And he showed unequivocally that the Italian first lockdown that threw the world into kind of madness, it came after the curve had turned, a Gompertz curve. It was clear as day. Their lockdown came in after the curve had turned naturally, which we know now it does, like influenza. And the trajectory of the curve did not change with the lockdown implementation. And we saw that everywhere over the following few months. The lockdown does not correlate with a change in the curve. Finito. And the world needs to know that, because we look at the damage that was caused.
Yeah,
that's incalculable.
And that's what happened too when you see the LA curves, and LA was going into back to the lockdowns, but the curve was already dropping by the time they couldn't implement it in time, because otherwise they would have said, look, we locked down and this got better, but it was happening anyways. So it happened without the lockdown. So when you see the curve, you say this is, because I could time it perfectly and go, okay, everyone wore red shoes on this day, and all of a sudden the numbers are going to come down, right? And so that's the problem, is people never said, hey, let's look at the natural curve that's been happening everywhere and compare it. I mean, you were showing data with North Dakota and South Dakota and all these different places. You go, wow, these curves do not fit what the media is telling us.
North Dakota and South Dakota it was like a diamond princess, because you got 1 million people in each, same geography, because the seasonality of SARS-CoV-2 and influenza forever, coronaviruses, in America, it's got multiple seasons in one massive landmass. So in Northern Europe, they're broadly the same, but in America, the South and the West Coast climate and Northeast New York, they're all completely different months that peak. And it was so clear from the earliest data I was sharing, so frustrating. Seattle did a mega lockdown and mega fast response. It was San Francisco or Seattle. And they were all whooping about how great they reacted and saying the rest of the country is not doing it like we did. But their mortality was around a little over half of New York, which was one of the worst in the country. And New York was blamed for not doing a lockdown. But if you correct for demographic, and kind of racial minorities and other factors, Seattle got the exact same impact as New York with a massive lockdown, and New York missed the boat. And they all acknowledged they were too late. It was clear as day. North and South Dakota are mirror image curves, but one of them had lockdowns and mask mandates, and one of them did not have business closures and lockdowns and had no masks. So masks and lockdowns together in two perfectly comparable 1 million people, same region, same culture, same everything. No difference. And Sweden romped home. At the time I was predicting it, it came true for me, not for me personally, but it couldn't have come true better to prove the point. Sweden had no masks, right? People need to understand that. The odd kind of person who was a little bit deranged had a mask on. No mask mandates and no masks in Sweden all the way throughout. And it had no lockdown. People who tell you, yeah, but they did kind of lock down. I have a lot of people in Sweden. I was over there twice in the 2.5 years. Forget about it. The bars were full. CNN went in there and interviewed people. They said, oh, the bars are full and people are not really doing anything. CNN video, I have it. So Sweden did effectively nothing worth a toss.
No, we watched it because I remember it was shocking, because we're all locked down here in San Diego even. And I was looking at Sweden going, holy cow. And then you see, Canada, where these people are wearing full body suits in the airport, and you go, wow, how can they have such a different take on this thing?
Well, the thing is, Brian, Sweden, as I described it, versus what you're describing in the mass formation, kind of crazy places, Sweden now has the lowest excess mortality in the whole list of 25 to 30 countries. And they have an aged demographic. They have a very aged demographic, much higher than Ireland in age, same as England. They have the lowest mortality in the full list of all of Europe and other countries from around the world. They're the best performer of all, with no lockdowns, no masks, and kids maintained in school up to 16 years old by force of law. The Swedish government told people, you are not allowed to take your kid under 16 out of school. It's bad for the child, and our studies have shown it's not going to help. You're not allowed to do it. Imagine that. And they came out with the best performance and no one talks about them anymore. They were vilified and attacked like you and me, but they were completely correct, 100% correct.
Well, I think as a doctor, I was seeing it early on, and I'm listening to you. I'm listening to other people. I'm kind of, we can't overreact. We gotta just kind of weigh the evidence and sit back and say, okay, which way is this thing gonna go? I mean, we're gonna feel the air a lot longer than you will probably. But you see the numbers and you start seeing it. And I started seeing the alcohol abuse, drug abuse, obesity, diabetes out of control, missed cancer diagnosis, and mental health issues through the roof. And people who don't understand, studies show that between 70 and 90% of what we see in the medical office is stress related. So you put people through this kind of chronic stress, and you see what kind of outcomes you get from all child abuse, spousal abuse, fighting in the streets. And we saw it happening in our society where people are just breaking down. They just couldn't take it anymore.
Yeah. And basically what happened in the world, we handed Big Pharma the keys to our whole world. And you can say there's Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance Group, very powerful. CEPI, the brand new pandemic management set up, linked to Gates. That's a really important organization. It was only set up in 2018. And you've got the WHO that are basically just a buddy system with Big Pharma. And I could go on all that day, the World Economic Forum. So people think, well, it had to be stupidity, because who else could orchestrate something so catastrophically wrong for humanity? The problem is, yes, there was a lot of stupidity and groupthink and mass formation. And yes, the media took the story and ran insane with it, driving the people insane. All of that's true. But there's a huge number of highly influential global organizations that pushed it one way and one way only. And from the start, I heard in March 2020, Brian, this phrase came up on multiple media outlets. Now, this is March, before the lockdowns. We'll never be returning to the old normal. And I'm a corporate guy. I was involved in a lot of skullduggery, right? And I knew there was something very odd afoot. How could all these different media outlets come out with that same phrase, we'll never be going back to the old normal? That had to originate from somewhere. It's a very specific set of words. Where is it coming from? So stuff was coming from many, many organizations. No conspiracy theory. With your own eyes, you could see it. It required a small engine of orchestration to keep the big engine of hysteria running. Now, the big engine of...
You see all those split screens, like with hundreds of news reporters saying the same exact phrases at the same time from all different conservative, liberal, whatever news you're watching, they were all saying the same thing. And you go, wow, that's kind of odd. Like, usually you're going to use a different term, like threat to humanity. When everyone says, this is a threat to humanity, this is a threat. And they use the exact same words and no one says, yeah, that's kind of odd. I mean, if you and I have a conversation, we're probably not going to use the same exact phrases to describe things. So it's very unusual.
Chinese whispers works against it, actually, that even if you want everyone to have the same message, you need to do a lot of work to make sure they have the same message. We know this in corporate management. Messages get confused if they're just let out there. So it really was very well managed from the tops of the media organizations that were working with the experts and the scientists. And they basically just took everything from very small nodes. People don't realize that. Like in the summer of 2020, the most shocking thing in my life happened. It was actually one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. This sounds like an exaggeration. What happened in the summer of 2020 is the clear seasonality was demonstrated. Clearly, Sweden had come out with one of the lowest impacts in Europe, even though they had no measures. So we were actually coming back, it appeared, towards sanity. And the ICUs were empty and the hospitals were empty and there was no COVID. Even though the media wanted COVID, they didn't have any. So nothing was really happening. There were cases, but you couldn't do much with that. In that environment, I said, we now have until October, November, because of seasonality, before much stuff happens with COVID. And there will be a seasonal resurgence. No question about it. It'll probably be worse because of all the messing we did, but hey, But right now we've got a few months to teach people and learn that we made a huge mistake. You know what happened in the middle of that, Brian? This is astonishing. Suddenly there was talk everywhere about masks being needed. And I'm not joking. There was no COVID or anything going on, and they didn't even say there was. They just simply started all saying we need masks because there could be like a Spanish flu second wave. You know, the weird Spanish flu autumn wave that came out of nowhere and hit young people? They were kind of saying that might happen. So they said, we need masks now in the middle of the summer with the hospitals empty. And the biggest shocking thing was a couple of weeks later, laws came in with fines and prison sentences, and mandatory masks blossomed all across Europe in the space of a couple of weeks when nothing was going on. And people did it. They wore them. And then I realized this is nothing about a virus. I mean, I was willing to say there was an element that it was about misguidedly trying to save Granny. But what I just described happened. And when people don't realize that did not come from all the health authorities across Europe, all looking around and seeing nothing going on, yet somehow all deciding we need masks, which makes no sense. That came from a committee or two up top. And it could have been 20 people in a room, of which 3 were influential and drove the committee outcome that we should be asking for mandatory masks across Europe. And it happened. But it could have been 3 or 4 people in a committee of 15 that actually made that absurdity happen. See, people don't understand the pyramidal nature. A tiny number at the top of the WHO or certain commissions or councils decide what's going to happen. And all the way down to the multitude, that just happens. Like you said about the, you know, everyone saying the same thing. It's not like everyone went mad.
Well, it was the same thing.
A small number went mad.
And it was the same thing as standing in circles. You thought you were safe if you were 6 feet apart. And all these things, like there was no data for any of those, closing down outside dining, all these things like, hey, if there's data, you know, you start doing it and you go, okay, this is making a difference. But it's just because someone goes, hey, this is a good idea. Let's just do that. Probably not in our best interest, especially when you know, as a doctor, I've dealt with all these people who lost their business. They lost their family farm they've had for all these years. They couldn't, you know, have customers at their gym. They couldn't, you know, go to church, and you lost your social connections. Like people were so, if you want to make someone crazy, put them in isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was part of it. And sadly, and again, we don't get into conspiracy theory. I always think of myself as the opposite of a conspiracy theorist, and with good reason. I'm a brutal rationalist. I'm a show me the data guy. I'm a cynic, and I'm hard-nosed. I will never fall for conspiracy theory because I don't believe anything till I've seen it myself and analyzed it. And yet I have to talk about things that people might say sound like conspiracy theories. A good example is I sent out a summary of Event 201, which was the Gates and Johns Hopkins. All the major media heads were there, the CDC, the who's who of who ultimately ran COVID were in a huge room at huge expense at Event 201. It's still actually up there, all the videos.
Yeah, you said a 2-minute summary this morning I watched.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you watch them simulating a coronavirus pandemic in November 2019, when coronavirus was actually found in Italy later from September 2019. And a lot of people moving in the virus world would know something was bubbling up in China from the summer, whether lab released or lab accident, doesn't matter. It would have been known at high levels that there's something very interesting going on. But they put together this pandemic scenario, bring in all the media heads, the CDC, you know, Johns Hopkins that were huge in driving the hysteria. You had Gates and all. You had a whole load of the top people who set the tone and run the pandemic. And we know they did largely at the top. And they all simulate. If you listen to the 2-minute clip, everything we saw that happened that made no sense, lockdowns, masking, misinformation and disinformation, and removing people from platforms who went against the pandemic management. Every single aspect of what happened in the last 2 or 3 bizarre years was pretty much worked through in that simulation. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. It's all on video. All of the nonsense they were saying about censoring people and bringing in, heavy troops and heavy clad police because there may be unrest and there would be disinformation and we'll have to get the major IT companies to take responsibility to censor it. Everything they said came to pass. That simulation wasn't a joke. That simulation took a lot of money and a lot of organization.
And they knew the psychology. They knew the psychology. And if you make people fearful, and that's, some of us argued, looking at the PCR when they were running it at 40 cycles, you're like, crud, that is so inaccurate. And so the numbers would be high, but I wasn't seeing in my practice sick people, but I was seeing positive tests and they weren't sick. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do with that. Go isolate like they're telling you to do, but they never got symptoms a lot of times. So then if you have a false positive test, or if you're in the hospital, and this is the reality. So people try to understand, like, it's hard because people want to paint you with a brush of saying, you think it's fake and it's not real. No, I'm not saying that. People are not saying that at all. But the problem is, I had patients in the hospital say they, had a bypass surgery. Every single day they're tested for COVID. And sooner or later, you're going to get a false positive, or you're going to get a positive test, but they were there for the bypass surgery they had. But if they were to die from complications of the bypass surgery, they were a COVID death, or within 3 months of that. So if you get hit by a truck 3 months later, you're still a COVID death. Yeah. So that's the problem, is the numbers did not match up to the sick people. And so we say cases, how many cases there were, and they kept just overwhelming us with that. So you have to sit back and go, okay, out of those cases, how many are ending up dead or in the hospital or in the ICU? And so that's when you start looking at that, you go, holy cow. I mean, why are we not focusing on how many sick people we have?
Yeah, no, what happened in Europe as well, when you had sick people seasonally, right, like flu, they talked all about sick people. And when they didn't have sick people, you had the case-demic. They just hyper-tested and hyper-tested because the only news and scaremongering they could do was cases. And then when the winter rolled in and there were ICU and deaths like flu, not much different than a bad flu, they used that. And it was quite clearly, we're never letting this end until we cannot continue it. And, the funny thing is, the cases, I was making the point till I was blue in the face, Brian. We in Ireland in the second wave, the first one, the testing wasn't hyper yet, but in the second wave, they were testing like crazy. It got up to 28, nearly 30% positivity in the testing. Now that includes people with symptoms and massive numbers who were just testing. Overall, 30% were positive, flowing through the test system in the peak. Well, right at that moment, if you had 50,000 people in hospital at that moment, and none of them had a COVID problem, but if you have 30% positivity, 30% of those 50,000, 15,000 would have COVID in hospital because of the way they defined it. So even if the positive test was only telling you that a person had a certain gene, right, that would make them intelligent, if you got 30% positivity, you could blame that gene on anything that befalls any of them in the hospital. I mean, it was fundamentally absurd.
But also they were using numbers to scare people when, for instance, they were saying, oh, the hospitals are at 92% capacity. I was like, they're always at 92% capacity because they would be out of business. That's always how it's always been since in my 20 years of practicing. So you start realizing, oh, they're really saying, oh my gosh, there's only so many beds left. But, and the reality, I mean, if you look at it, when you have a major pandemic happening, the first wave is going to kill the most people because most of the fragile, sick people are going to get knocked off first. So you should see that first year in 2020, we should have had a huge excess mortality rate, right? And then the other thing we noticed too is the flu disappeared at the same time, which is I don't think I've heard a good answer as to how that could have possibly happened at the same time.
Yeah, they did stop kind of looking at flu, but it's not just that, because the flu disappeared in Sweden too, and they had no lockdown, no masks, and kids up to 16 in school. That goes back to Hope Simpson, really, and I think differential interfering particles, DIPs. So there's an area of science that has not been explored around the subtlety and extraordinary complexity of these viruses. And basically, it's viral interference. That when you have a dominant virus coming into a host population, often other viruses inactivate. And there's been various papers came out, like by exposing you to rhinovirus, you can actually give protection from COVID exposure. But also when COVID, which I think we all accept now, or should, was a laboratory gain of function developed virus, when it came in, one of the effects was that the flu virome kind of just backed off and inactivated. And that's very hard for people to understand, viral interference. But I mean, there's massive complexity here. You take an example, Brian, this might help people. For 50, 60, 70 years, they have been studying the seasonality of influenza. All the best people, all the studies. You know what? They still say they don't understand it. That's how subtle viruses are. And Hope Simpson spent over 50 years, and his book, The Transmission of Influenza, actually does answer it. He hypothesizes the answer. He doesn't have pure proof. Makes a beautiful root cause treatment. And I think he's right. And he brings up viral interference as well. Like, people don't know, when the flu came in the 70s, a new strain appeared out of nowhere. And they're all like, huh? And then they looked around and simultaneously the old one disappeared. I mean, it just winked out of existence. Now, that's a slightly different phenomenon. But all of these phenomena are complex. But the industry and the business that drove COVID wanted to push under the carpet any of those nuances. So what was the answer, Brian, for the flu disappearing? It shows you how good lockdowns and masks are. And Sweden with no lockdown, no masks, and kids up to 16 in school, effectively no intervention to any honest person. Their flu dropped off the map too. And they had the same impact as everyone else. Actually, the best, lowest impact of all of Europe. I mean, what can you say? Like, it's not just proven.
It's remarkable that more people aren't sitting back and looking at this and then analyzing it and saying, hey, we have to treat this differently in the future, you know?
No, it's mass formation, Brian. People now, even if subconsciously, they're picking up on the fact that the vaccine didn't stop transmission and that was a lie, and that the lockdown didn't really do anything. It probably just caused horrific damage, which it did. And if they're looking around thinking the masks are kind of nonsense because it's an aerosol and it's ubiquitous. And even if they're thinking that, the second thought subconsciously is, I'm not opening my mouth because it's too big and too screwed up. I don't want to go there. And a lot of people do tell you now, even when they're beginning to realize a bit, they just say, oh, look, let's move on. But if you just move on, this madness is going to happen again and again. I mean, that's unthinkable.
And it's amazing people are asking for amnesty now. It is really interesting to me that, you know, now we're seeing the consequences, and and we're going to feel these consequences for a long time to come. And so now people are saying, well, yeah, it was the fog of war. We didn't know what we were doing. And, you know, it was like, well, hell, you can't lock down a society unless you have data saying that this is beneficial, like not just because 3 guys get together and think it's a good idea and everyone has to do it. Anyone who questions that is a denier.
That's the key thing, that you can ask for a kind of amnesty if you screwed up, and if the majority screwed up, which they obviously did. If you had argued with the dissenters and the logical, analytical, rational people who countered with data, if you kept arguing with them openly and you just didn't agree with them, even though they were clearly seemed to be right, and you persisted, you could still claim some kind of, well, we didn't know, and I know you said it and you were right, but at the time we believed this data. But you can't claim amnesty when you masked little kids. That's child abuse based on anti-science. When you destroyed businesses. And particularly, you can't claim amnesty when you supported the vilification and the censorship of the people who were actually correct, and forced them to take medications which made no sense for them, and vilified them and partitioned them like apartheid, when they wouldn't take your stupid medication that was going to do them no benefit and probably cause them potentially some harm, to force a human being to take a medication that you know is no benefit to them. I mean, that never would have happened. That never happened until 21. I mean, it happened in totalitarian regimes where they did medical experiments on people. But short of that, it never happened in the modern Western
But then we had
democratic
the
world.
but then we had the Nuremberg Code after that, and then it just
Supposedly,
disappeared somewhere.
it was basically, I mentioned earlier, top foundations, top organizations, the UN, WEF, and WHO, and I could go on all day. They were all in lockstep. They all agreed the pandemic was something that would go X way. And they drove that from the top. So a small, relative small number compared to the millions of citizens and decent politicians, a tiny number of humanity drove down edicts, and they were all implemented. Does that sound familiar? That's totalitarianism. That's what it is. It's a small group that have control. That,
well, and the other thing is, Ivor, the big thing that I kept sitting back and being a doc, when I was at training, you'd have grand rounds, and one person said, "Hey, you have heart failure. Here's how we treat it. Here's how I treat it." And you would have a discussion about that.
Yeah.
And say, well, and one idea is going to be better and it's going to win. When you came out, you were asking people, let's debate this publicly. No one wanted to touch it. And then I just saw Ioannidis and Jay Bhattacharya. I'm butchering their names. I apologize. But
Bhattacharya, yeah.
Yeah, and these guys came out and they go, okay, let's debate this publicly just recently, and no one wanted to take it. No one wanted to touch that, because they have data and they have science, and it's a hard thing when you like, if for instance, if you're spreading misinformation, I would say, let's talk about this publicly and let's talk about it. Say, look, you're wrong. Here's the data, and the data actually shows. And then you put it to rest by censoring the other side. Like you and I have been censored. You say, well, at least listen and go, is it possible that this came from a lab? Is it possible? Is it possible these things? We need to question and say, okay, it's not true. Okay, show us your data that it's not true. And I'll show you my data that it is true. And then we can have a discussion that reasonable people decide. But when you shut down one side of the one side of the discussion, then there's always going to be misinformation and disinformation.
Exactly. Science progresses through debate and dissent and disagreement. It always has, it always will. In 2020, it was decided the scientific method was no longer desired. That's just a fact. Put in any conspiracy you want or blame anyone you want. I've said many times, the scientific method ended in 2020. I know people have abused it before, but in real terms, it ended in 2020. And censorship, I asked the question, look back through the whole of human history. When was censorship, mass censorship, and vilification of people dissenting or arguing, when was it ever done by the good guys or the good regimes? And the answer is never, because it never is. Good guys and good organizations do not run after censorship and vilifying of people. They just don't. Bad people do, and bad organizations and bad ideologies. And that's a simple fact. So if people look back now at the whole corona and look at the behaviors of the people who drove all of the measures that we know are wrong now, lockdown, masks, all that stuff, vilification, mandates for something that doesn't stop transmission, it's absurd. Everything they did was wrong in retrospect, and some of us knew at the time, but let's say in retrospect, looking back, we know it's all wrong. So they were all wrong, and they did unthinkable things to humanity, like censorship and mandates. I mean, literally everything about, there was a phrase once about evil and stupidity are the same if you judge by the results. Now, I think there was a lot of evil at many layers and a ton of stupidity. But at the end of the day, the outcome is as I described. Nearly everything done was wrong. And loads of things were done that were against all principles of human rights and inalienable personal freedoms and rights. It's just shocking, really. I'm just, as I say it, I'm thinking of how truly shocking the last 3 years are. And there's still people defending it. And God rest their souls.
And they will too. I think some people, they'll never unsee what they've seen, and they'll never, they believe something to be true no matter what the evidence shows. And it's a hard thing, because I wonder the same thing. I go, is this ignorance? Is this some of these leadership decisions? Is this ignorance, or is it malignant? Is it that you want to cause, and really you have to look at that and sit back and go, okay, again, and it's frustrating for me living in California because they say, well, if you go outside the party line and you question it, you lose your medical license. I'm well aware of that. And so
Yeah.
you go, okay, what do I do? My job is to discuss the risk and benefits. So if I can only discuss the benefit without the risk, then I'm not doing my job. I'm
Mm.
violating medical ethics. So it's a tough one because, at the beginning, I sit back, Ivor, when you came out, and I'm like, okay, what does Ivor have to gain from this? What is that?
Mm.
Like, I mean, you're not paid by pharma clearly, and you're not paid by big money. And you go, okay, why would you take a stand? And I had that question, but I had the unfortunate of knowing you as a person before this, right? Sitting down, talking to you about life and what matters and all those kind of things. And so I knew you as a man and your character. I'm like, oh crud, Ivor's going out there and like what I mean, it's like one guy taking the hill and everyone else just sat back and said, good luck. I'm
Mm.
not saying anything publicly, but behind the scenes, I'll say something like, and I even reached out to you and go, Ivor, are you sure on this stuff? Because this is this is a career ender. Are you kidding me? This is controversial. Like, why even going there? And I
Yeah.
had a good friend say, Brian, Ivor's kryptonite. I go, but he's been right so far. And I know he's looking at the data and he's not just going to jump on emotion. He's going to say, even if it's not popular, he's going to say something that's like, man, have we lost that in our society? Self-sacrifice, I think. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about
Mm.
you yesterday. Someone posted a picture and it was a sheepdog all bloodied up fighting off the attacker, and the sheep was rubbing its head against him like, thanks man, I appreciate it. But I was like, the only difference between you and that sheepdog, really, I mean, you're covered in blood and all, is that a lot of the sheep are never going to thank you for saying, hey, this is the right way to go.
Yeah, well, listen, thanks, Brian, but it's yeah, it doesn't bother me as much as it would most because I think, like I said earlier, I'm a hard kind of breed after 30 years in corporate, and also my driving force. You're right, money. I threatened my income. I have 5 kids and a family. I took redundancy and I was finishing up a contract, and I was going out into an area where I could end up in serious, serious trouble financially. That was my expectation. That's what kept me awake at night when I was pursuing this. I didn't know if Patreon and all would support me enough, but I took a risk. And I said in so many podcasts, there's 2 reasons. One is truth and science. It's just a personal thing with me my whole career. I hate when truth and science is perverted or twisted or everyone's wrong on something. It drives me crazy. But the other thing is the future of the children. I have 5 kids. We're focused on the future. Wife's a first-class honors engineer. She said to me, are you sure? Just like you said, Brian. Didn't take me long to go through the data. And she said, oh, she said, what are they at? And I said, I don't know. That was early on. But the future of the children, it became clear. And it was absolutely clear in summer of 2020 with the mask example. I said, there's no place for me to hide now that this is stupidity. Because no one, no country, no team, no politician, no one can be stupid enough to force humanity to cover their faces under prison sentence or fines, punishment. That's a shocking thing to do. And they did it in the middle of the summer. They actually did it, Brian, unfortunately, and I know this is terrible to say, but it's true. I was wondering in April and May, how are they going to keep any level of hysteria going to bridge the big summer canyon until COVID comes back in the seasonal resurgence next October, November? They're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to keep the madness going. And I was actually gleeful. I was. And then they just did something smarter than I even predicted. It was the one time where they actually caught me out, the audacity and the intelligence of it. They filled the summer with mask madness that made everyone feel it was all pandemic-y still. It was genius, Brian.
Yeah,
Hand the enemy
there's a
you.
mental part of such a mental thing, because during the lockdown here, I went to Arizona and I was thinking, these people are not wearing masks everywhere, and they're not, like, California is totally different. Southern California is a lot different than Northern California. Northern California still is really strict on a lot of stuff compared to us and down in San Diego. And the farther north you go, the more strict it becomes. So,
Yeah,
and the craziness, Ivor, is we just had elections last night. All the same people who did the lockdowns all got
I
reelected back
know.
in office in New York and California and all these places. You think, wow, that's like you're putting the prison guards back in charge again. And it's amazing to me that there's a psychology to this. or there's nefarious things, I don't know. But you think, wow, this is like, you didn't learn. Like, I think sometimes we just don't learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, that's it. But as Matthias Desmet, Professor Desmet said, a mass formation changes all the rules. And he said, basically, it drives a line of steel down between all existing social groups, families, working groups, friends, clubs. The mass formation drives a line down the middle of them and separates them into those who are backing the narrative and the new ideology, and those who are questioning it. And that line goes through families. I know countless people write to me where their family are not really talking anymore because some of them were rational and questioning and concerned about the madness, people like us. And other members of the family decided, or didn't decide, became caught up in the mass formation,
Well,
hypnosis.
they think you're crazy and you think they're
They
crazy,
think
and
you're
that's the
crazy.
problem. Everyone
And
thinks
like, you
everyone's
show them.
crazy, and that's the problem we run into, is instead of saying, okay, you see it your way, I see it my way, let's talk about it, and so it's a
They won't
hard
talk.
thing.
They won't talk. That's the point in a mass formation. The 30% or more will actually fall for it completely, and they will not talk to you. You are the enemy now because there's a new religion in town and they've got it. It's a cult. So they've got it. Another 40 or 50% have varying degrees of doubt about the new religion, but they know there's a big chunk of people and a majority and the leaders and experts supporting it. So they keep their mouth shut and they just do a psychological kind of rebalancing. It's called a reframing, that when you see everyone around you going a certain way and you question it, a lot of people will just simply reset their frame of reference psychologically and just say to myself, I'm going to accept it.
Well,
subconsciously.
when you understand, I had a friend involved in a cult one time, and it's amazing because it was a Christian cult, right? And what they were doing was they would say, hey, the leaders would say, okay, God will tell us what you need to do. Like, they'll tell me, and then I tell you, Ivor, here's what God tells you have to do, right? It's like, wouldn't God just tell that person directly? First of all. Second of all, they say, well, if anyone questions the leadership or anything we're doing, it's a lie from the devil, so that that you can see it right away. So anything I say is the truth, but anyone comes against, and that's kind of what we went through in that way. And if anyone questioned, and honestly, I think you got so much venom because you were in the way of freedom. And I just said something like this on a tweet I sent out, but I was like, okay, my job as the doctor, if there's a fire in the building, first of all, I have to assess how big the fire is. Right? How much is that a threat to you dying of the fire? And I also have to know if you're on the 34th floor or you're on the first floor, because it might be a good idea to jump out the window if you're on the first floor and it's a huge fire. But if it's a tiny fire in the kitchen, I don't think it's a good idea to jump out the window on the 34th floor. And I think people just thought they were all, that there was only one way out. Anyone who was in that way was going to be taken down, because you're taking away my freedom. Like, you are the one taking away their freedom, Ivor, because you're messing up their only thing that can bring sanity to the world.
I know. It's fundamental ideology, is belief system in a narrative. As Desmond said, once the narrative gains hold, and of course all the media scream it and they point and say anyone questioning it is bad, is wrong, then you're in a mass formation, and all the rules change because there's no more discussion. You've now got censorship, vilification, you've got authoritarianism, totalitarianism, domination of small numbers of exclusive elite groups in health running the whole pandemic show. You've got a system where the only thing, though, Desmet said, is it's crucial that people like me or like you in our different ways question. Because although 100 years ago, a professor, I forget his name, who studied this said, although the dissenters, the smallish percentage of questioners, cannot stop the mass formation, cannot fix it because the masses are lost, they're on this crazy train, they do stop the mass formation becoming catastrophic, where the mass formation will start literally locking up anyone who questions. So questioning stops the mass formation. It disturbs a ripple in the ideology, the narrative, and it stops it going to its end stage, like Stalin in the 30s. Down to complete depravity.
Where do you think we are now, Ivor?
Well, I think that all of I had a thought experiment for someone just the other day. They were saying, well, all the dissenters did great work to wake up so many people, etc. But at the end of the day, it still ran its course. It was still shocking, and we have new laws, and we've lost our freedoms, and there was mandates. We kind of lost. But I said, can you imagine the world today if no one had questioned it? Do you know where we'd be right now?
I know where we'd be. I know damn well where we'd be.
It'd be over. If no one, and people say, oh,
people
well,
don't
no,
realize, I think about that all the time. How close were we to have this, universal passport? You're not going to be able to shop. You're not going to be able to work. You can't. I mean, it's happened to a lot of people. It's a reality for them too. I mean, I have a lot of doctors and nurses who lost their careers. Physical therapists lost their careers after 20 years of dedicated service to the, after going through the first wave. After putting their butts on the line when other doctors were sitting in the comfort of their home doing Zoom meetings and phone calls. These were the ones, Aaron Cariotti who got it. So he goes,
great man.
Right? And he's standing up because he's good. I don't see any way unless there's corruption. I mean, it's really it's going to be hard, especially now that the idea has changed a lot as far as what the CDC is now saying, and people are changing their tunes. And what we said a long time ago, we were just right too early, right, with PCR testing. And you look at it and you go, okay, now they're going to what we were saying, that, and everyone said we were nuts for saying that. And then the time, is there anything, Ivor? By the way, I want you to answer this question too. But is there anything you look back now and go, I had it wrong?
No,
I wish I would have double checked that, because it's hard, because when you're predicting, it's like, a lot of people are wrong.
We're not going to be
right
on everything. I mean, Gabor Doshi, when we talked about that way back in 2020, he was saying at the end of the day, people don't understand. What's important is to be broadly correct in a framework. And he said, there's no question, Ivor, your and my framework, Gabor's a bit of a genius, to be honest.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy.
Is correct. But that doesn't mean that every single item out of myriad items and predictions, that every single one will be correct. That's like God, if you believe in God. That's impossible. But is your framework correct overall and the right path forward or not? And what turned out, and I did a talk in Amsterdam recently at a science summit, uncensored, and I went through a checklist of around 13 items, the key vectors. And to be honest, Brian, I was correct substantially or meaningfully on every single one. However, the one my enemies got was, I did not predict a second wave of great magnitude in the UK particularly. Many of my enemies were corporate think tank people in the UK. They came after me from every side. And what they used again and again was, Ivor said there'd be no second wave. And actually what I'd said, but they caught me on it. Because of the immunity and because of the aged passing, which I kept saying, the second wave is not going to be as impactful, and it's not going to be a Spanish flu second wave. They were all threatening the Spanish flu second wave worse than the first. I said, no way. There'll be a winter resurgence, it's a seasonal virus, but I reckon it'll be lower impact in the UK, and it might be more like 18 or 15 or 99, the bad flu years. And I actually was entirely correct. So the one thing I was wrong on, I was kind of right on. The Actuarial Society in the UK in May 21 looked at the whole of May, January to 21, and there was a spike in mortality. But instead of staying high mortality for that whole period, they actually had a slump in mortality a month later, and they ended up by May, the rolled up mortality from January to May 21 was less than 2018 and 2015, same period. So there was a bump, but it was way lower than the initial one, which is what I said.
Yeah,
but that was the closest I came.
All-cause mortality right before this too. The year before was unusually low. So yeah, and it's really when you start looking, well, probably in a year from now, Ivor, I think we'll have a discussion on all-cause mortality, because I think that is the big thing. As a doc, I care about all-cause mortality. And if you ask me, and I think this data, Ivor, but if I have a 22-year-old, what's the number one thing that's going to kill them? If I have a patient between the age of 19 and 49 years of age, what's their most likely thing they're going to die of? In the United States?
I mean, heart disease is the biggest one.
It's fentanyl overdose.
Oh, okay. That's an American thing I wouldn't be as familiar with.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We have fentanyl overdose. So if I look at all my patients, like, guess what? I'm going to talk about drug abuse and alcohol and
Yeah,
depression and anxiety and
of
stress and all
course.
these things, because that's the
Hey,
biggest intervention. Now, obviously, as we get older, heart disease and diabetes complications, all those.
yeah,
But guess what? All those got worse too by the lockdown. Everything that I
of,
treat got worse. There's
of
nothing that
course.
improved. The only people who improved are the salesmen who are whining and dining all the time. And then they couldn't wine and dine anymore, and they stopped eating that stuff, and then they got healthier and lost weight, and their sugars got better. That's the only group I saw improve during this whole thing, right? Or people who
Yeah.
got locked down and go, look, I'm gonna be stuck at home. I'm just gonna start working out and taking care of myself at home, and I'm gonna do it. Those are the people
You
who did
get some of
better.
that.
But when you look
Yeah.
at what I worry about as a doctor, all cause mortality, which is I can't just look at one diagnosis, it all got worse.
It all got worse and massively worse. And we're seeing it now all across Europe and America, post-vaccine, post-COVID almost. Very high mortalities. And I know some people are trying to blame the emergency use novel medication thing. To be honest, I said in 2020, the lockdowns will have long-term sequelae based on the psychology, the missed cancer, the missed cardiac, and all this. You drop a rock like that into the pond of humanity and human mortality, and there's going to be ripples. It's hard to say exactly what. I think most of the mortality now is a follow-on from the madness rather than being driven, the majority of it, by the novel medications. To be honest, I think they may cause a lot of morbidity and reactions, but I don't think they're coming up in the mortality yet. That's just my perception. I think it's the thing we fought all of 2020 is what's coming home to cause enormous damage. It was madness.
Yeah, it is. It's just incredible. But I think hopefully most of us learned something. Hopefully we kind of, I think like
Yeah,
when you
we
said
did.
30% won't, but when you have the so I'm seeing a lot of people coming in way more savvy when they come and talk to me, and their perspective has changed dramatically in the last year. I mean, it's a dramatic difference in mindset.
I think, Brian, that's important to end on a positive point, and it's genuinely positive. A friend of mine who's super savvy, a couple of quick points because I have a 4 p.m. meeting, but one quick point that's interesting is all of the top people in low carb, because I have hundreds of professors, doctors, yourself included, in the low carb and metabolic world. I have a top tier, and I won't name them because a lot of them had to keep quiet. But my very top tier of the best technical, best, smartest professors and doctors, the very top tier, every one of them agreed with me throughout COVID. Now, we got a lot of losses in low carb, a lot of lay people losses, and a lot of doctor losses who fell for the mass formation. The top tier didn't. And in my corporate world, I've worked with some of the best problem solvers, technical people, and technical managers. I really have. And people, my top tier in corporate, the same thing. So the very top people did not fall. And the other positive thing is that one of my top corporate guys who just could not believe how insane it got, he told me early on, Ivor, he says, you're right, but it'll fizzle out. I said, look, you're going to be getting mandates probably for these vaccines. He said, come on. I agree with you on all the technical, Ivor. This was in the summer of 2020, but come on. He had to apologize later when it happened. I knew that was coming because I saw the news.
The good people will apologize. The good people will apologize and go, yeah, you had it right. Other ones will never do it out of ego, especially because you got that Irish gloating you're going to do to people too, right?
Well, I try
we all
not
are
to.
aware of that. I'm like, crap.
But the thing, the story wasn't about that so much. He didn't really have to apologize because all he said is, I don't think so. He didn't argue. But when he had to get mandated because he works for an American firm, and he just said, this has completely gone nuts, even beyond what you said at the start, Ivor. And I said, I know, but I told you. But anyway, he told me after the 2 shots in the passports in Ireland, and when they were gone, no one was taking the booster. All the engineers and everyone he knew who fell for the 2 shots in the passports and went along with the whole nonsense, every one of them, all these engineers and everyone was saying, I'm not getting a booster. And they were all saying, I'm not getting the kids vaccinated. So there was a limit that was reached. And I think you're right, Brian, that now there's a lot more awareness in people who went along, not the 30%, their brains are mush. But there's a lot of people who just supported it and went along with it and said, I don't want to argue about it, who are now looking, going, it's kind of nuts. because
People watch,
booster
they
after
watch
booster
outcomes.
after booster.
It's not because of misinformation. They watch outcomes in their family and friends and themselves, and
Yeah.
they looked and they go, wait a minute. So Ivor, I got to ask you before you leave, life's best medicine
Yeah.
for you, man.
What is life's best medicine?
Yeah. What gets you
For
going?
me?
What makes you be a pain in the butt and keep going and be a fly in the ointment
Well,
and all this kind of stuff?
yeah, I kind of meant what keeps me going is I said truth and science and the future of children. But to be honest, truth and science I could live without. It's the future of humanity. And I'm fully backed by my family. My wife's a first-class honors engineer. It took me no time in March 2020 to explain to her. And she said, wow. And she never lost it. The whole madness was clear to her and gave her a lot of stress. So my kids and all are very smart, you know, and they all got it from the start. So the whole family and my people, professionals, corporate colleagues all around Ireland, we met up during the lockdowns, we meet up still. So people keep me going. And what really drives me is it's the future for everyone, and especially the children. And that's how I keep going and going and going, because what else is there? I mean, at the end of the day, what, I'm going to go and try and get a nicer car? I don't give a shit about cars. Sorry about the language. You know, I just don't need stuff. I'm a fighter. I like fighting injustice, kind of, not in a virtuous way, just in an instinctive, I like a fight way. So there's a bit of that too.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, man. It's good to have you. And I knew we'd go long talking about this stuff, but it's really important. I'm really glad you came back. I really appreciate it. But we'll get you back and talk about the stuff you're changing your focus now to low carb and cardiovascular risk and all that. So let's do this again when you got time, and we'll talk about that stuff. And then we'll put links to all that too.
And great job you did, Brian, as well. You're a medical doctor. You got to be super careful, or there's no point like burning yourself for nothing. So you did an incredible job considering the restrictions. And I was much more free than a lot of people because I'm self-employed, supported by the world. I don't have a license to lose. So I want people to understand that too. I had the ability to be aggressive. But one last quick thing, 19th, 20th November, we're doing our second We Love Our Heart online conference. And we've got EADS, we've got Dr. Arthur Agatston, we got Dr. William Davis, Ken Berry and Sean Baker have agreed to come on and give talks. So watch my feeds. That conference is running the whole weekend, 19th to 20th of November. It's going to be great.
Awesome. Hey, and let me, for people who want to track you down, I know you're at Fat Emperor on Twitter. How do people track you down?
I'd say if you put my name in a search engine, it still works, even for me. And you'll kind of hit my YouTube, my Twitter and Facebook, but at Fat Emperor on Facebook, and thefatemperor.com, which I don't do as much with, mainly YouTube and Twitter. I'm on Insta too, but Ivor Cummins, I think I am on Insta. I'm trying to get back into that, but yeah, you'll find it.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, Ivor. Have a great day.
Great. Have a great one, Brian. Good man. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and Spotify or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information, and hopefully this helps you. Have a great day, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.